Hello. All right. So we are continuing a series of essays by Kaepernick Publishing called Abolition for the People. Today's is, I'll go ahead and put the link for it, called No Justice, No Freedom by Derrick Hamilton. There's a very extensive New Yorker article on Derrick Hamilton, which I would also recommend to read. And I'll post that link up as well. But I'm not going to fully go into that, but because, his essay covers a fair bit of this. And there's a couple other things that I want to get into tonight. I might do a full segment on his case at some point, because it's the case of someone who lost, half their life because the criminal justice system is unjust. Let's dive right into it. No justice, no freedom. Criminal justice reform cost me 21 years of my life. And before we get into this, just want to say for anyone who is new to the stream, this is intended as kind of discussion. I'll be doing asides every now and then to expand on things that I'm reading or give thoughts on them. And if you have any thoughts or comments that you want to make, feel free to chime in. I don't. It's intended as kind of a discussion because these are things that need talking about. Yeah. President Clinton's infamous 1994 crime bill is just one example of why reform never goes far enough and often only exacerbates the issues it's meant to solve. So again, as a reminder, this is the second essay in the fuck reform section of the series of essays. In 1994, New York State convicted me of a murder I did not commit. Like countless others, I was found guilty of causing harm, when in fact I was victimized by a system that often uses fabricated evidence to fill prison cells with black men just like me. For 21 years, I languished in prison, my time stolen by Bill Clinton's infamous 1994 crime bill. The legislation was publicized as a much-needed reform to get drugs off the street, but like so many other reform efforts, framed as ways to make our criminal legal system fair and equal for all, it gave police and the prison system the means to incarcerate people without concern for justice itself. In 2015, I was exonerated. Some years previous, a woman whose testimony had helped secure my conviction recanted it, claiming that one of the investigating detectives had coerced her into testifying. The same detective, Louis Scarcella, has had 16 cases overturned. Ultimately, a Brooklyn district attorney investigating old cases overturned my conviction. While incarcerated, I studied law and was able to find paths to freedom not just for myself, but for other incarcerated people who had been wrongfully convicted. I learned that the average lawyer has too many cases, not enough time to litigate zealously. If I were ever to get out of prison, I realized I would have to file motions on my own and assist my lawyers in proving my innocence. While I was incarcerated, no one else had a vested interest in me achieving this goal. This is by design. So yeah, One of the things that we talked about last week was how the system really doesn't have uh, it is not an impartial system, and it is absolutely not a perfect system. People who are innocent can get caught up in the system very easily. They dead naming is when you refer to a trans person by their name before they become trans and adopt a name that is of their appropriate gender. Of their, so it's basically it's I know the question wasn't to me, but sometimes Mona goes on lurk mode. I didn't know. Yeah. And so this, this system, there's a lot of pressure to get convictions, and there's not pressure to actually impartially carry out justice. So, like, the way that it works with a lot of people is they will get arrested, convicted, they will get arrested, and then pressured into taking a guilty plea because otherwise they're stuck, and they can start getting on with the process of, getting their start doing their time and start like working towards getting out, rather than having a lengthy trial process. Sometimes a guilty plea, they're assured that they'll have a lighter sentencing or something as well. Because even if they're innocent, if they're stuck in jail for 3-4 months, they could be having their lives ruined in that time period. But in his case, there was a detective who coerced testimony against him. So let's take a look at him. This is Derrick Hamilton leaves a courthouse in the Brooklyn borough of New York after hearing that vacated his 1991 murder conviction. One of the most daunting hurdles I encountered as a person incarcerated by the New York State Department of Corrections and Community Supervision was the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, AEDPA, a 1996 bill that President Clinton signed into law. This law, also publicized as an important reform, made it the case that once a person held in a state facility has exhausted their state remedies, they can no longer pursue federal recourse unless they can prove that an unreasonable application of United States Supreme Court precedent occurred. This effectively creates an extremely narrow legal window and takes away the power of judges to release someone who they know is illegally confined. Clinton's 1994 and 1996 bills were essentially designed to do three things. 1. Give police and government officials the tools to fight what they deemed an extended war on drugs in black and brown communities. And 2. build more prisons, particularly solitary confinement units. 3. Lock up more black and brown people in the process, pushing them through the difficult-to-understand criminal legal system. Now, unfortunately, what we find is a lot of people who are not, the de facto targets of these laws in implementation don't see this. They are fed concerns about, drugs, especially, drugs getting into the hands of kids or whatever, and that is used as justification to push these kinds of reforms into place. And there's a lot of language that goes into justifying them, such as, well, we don't want these people just constantly appealing and putting a drain on the system once they're held in state custody. So even though people should be given the right to appeal, they put limitations on it, and they call it a cost-cutting measure. But what it does, like he says here, is it shuts doors that should be assured rights. For example, the 1996 bill imposed a 1-year statute of limitations for filing for habeas relief. This provision created an undue burden on non-lawyers to understand the complexity of this new enactment. President Clinton's reform law took away federal review of state court convictions to incarcerated people who perhaps have not had the luxury of years of formal legal training. They could not understand what an unreasonable application of United States precedent meant, let alone how to apply it. The so-called Truth in Sentencing bill that President Clinton signed in 1994 was publicized as a way to curb drug offenses. This gave police, both in New York City and beyond, the power to conduct illegal stop-and-frisk searches, plant evidence, and falsify reports to justify an arrest. This created a quota system in which police felt the only way to move up the ranks was to make more arrests. These are things that we have talked about, and the incentives that are created by the system. Notably, of course, the language of the bill doesn't put things in these explicit terms. These are the implicit effects of the law. And that's a really important distinction to make, because people get confused very easily. They're like, oh, well, the law doesn't say that. It's like, yeah, it may not say that explicitly, but if it shields police from legal consequence for falsifying reports or for planting evidence, and there's no downside to doing so, and there's an upside in obtaining arrests, then all the incentive is to do those things. I wonder how much the American culture bias against bureaucracy feeds into this. Not just cops and lawmakers, but citizens seem to view following procedure closely being difficult in ways. Yeah. Another reason that I'm glad that he's hammering on these in particular is the problems that exist in our legal system and the injustice of our carceral state is bipartisan in nature. Democrats are not the answer to resolving it. Obviously, Republicans are not either, but I think it is useful to point that out. But yeah, I think you maybe somewhat correct there, Shaloon. Although I think a larger part of it is our kind of cop worship and our reluctance to the opposite side of cop worship, which I think a lot of people have just been conditioned to avoid or have a knee-jerk reaction to, is admitting that cops can get it wrong. And a lot of people do not want to admit that. They want to say, oh, well, okay, maybe there's a handful of bad cops, but it's not about an individual officer. It's systems in place that create incentives to do things badly, or systems in place which just unfairly put burdens on the incarcerated. Whether that be the bail system or these limitations on being able to appeal their arrest or what have you. Hadn't considered before. Yeah. I think it gets in the way of presenting alternatives or being sympathetic to arrested people. Yeah. You could be correct there, for sure. You see the same thing in the immigration debate, actually. How people are just like, well, they should just come in legally, without ever actually appreciating how completely dysfunctional the legal immigration system actually is. Right? Like, there's an assumption that if you're caught up in the legal system at some point, you are in the wrong, when it's so convoluted that pretty much anyone could be arrested for something, or justification for their arrest could be made out of whole cloth, and they could be arrested all the same. And that is just kind of part of the bureaucratic system of our massive law enforcement machine. And it shouldn't be that way. Like, if it was pared down and more focused on rehabilitation and community health, I would imagine that structure would look a lot simpler in implementation and would be a lot less bureaucratic. It says, I had a cop look for every reason he could to arrest me for the crime of riding in a car while being visibly queer a few months ago. Yeah. That is definitely a thing that happens, and is happening a lot more in some states towards trans folks. Especially as some of these, obviously, like, bathroom bills and other thing and all that are going on the books. Like, they're trying to create justifications just to arrest trans people for existing in public spaces, because those who are trying to do this stuff, yeah, they definitely want to. They want to erase their out groups. I mean, genocide needs to be called what it is, and that's what it is. Germany didn't start with the death camps. They moved there 1 inch at a time through what they could get people to buy into. And people who just wanted to stay on the fence about shit did so, and things got worse and worse and worse. Yeah, I don't want to. Sorry, it does upset me how passive too many people are about this stuff. And like, I mean, the reason that I bang on about this stuff is that the attitude that needs to be internalized is the whole, as long as some aren't free, none of us are free. Or even the other adage of first they came for. Because I am in pretty much every privileged group. I could happily live a comfortable life and just turn a blind eye to all this shit. I no longer think that that is living as even just a decent person. And a lot of people do say, you know, such and such, they're not bigoted. They just don't really get involved. I don't think that's acceptable anymore. I mean, marginalized communities would say it's never been acceptable, but, you know, I say anymore because I used to be more on that side of thinking. No, yeah, I don't. I feel like this, like, if I ask myself, like, how many of my family or close friends would I watch be murdered by police on TV before I acted out? And it's like, it would take one, and I would be just absolutely enraged. So if that's the case, and I actually view other people as equals, as my neighbors, you know, then I need to share in that outrage. And I need to call out that injustice as if it were my own. I don't know. That's how I see it anyway. Yeah. I'll be talking a bit more in depth about that after this, because since critical race theory is all going around as something to be feared of, I decided tonight would be a good night to talk about it. I've been reading up on it a fair bit. So anyway, back to this. We must abolish any system that permits prosecutors and judges to be protected by the 11th Amendment, which gives them immunity when they abuse their power. By holding prosecutors and judges accountable, police will then have to answer for their actions, because the prosecutor or judge can't protect them. Accountability would entail removing them from office when there is proof that they have violated their oath of candor to the courts and fairness to the accused. An ethical oath all judges and prosecutors swear to uphold. Now, it bears reading. There's not a lot of text to the 11th Amendment, but so let's go ahead and read it. The judicial power of the United States shall not be construed to extend to any suit in law or equity, commenced or prosecuted against one of the United States by citizens of another state or by citizens or subjects of any foreign state. Now, this has been interpreted pretty extensively and pretty broadly to mean that it won't let a state be sued without its own consent. And so a judge counts as part of the state structure, it seems, rather than as an individual judge. So he kind of gets the protection of a state. Now, my understanding of this may be a little off. I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but that's from what I could kind of read. That's where that protects judges and state prosecutors. The 13th Amendment should also be abolished because it permits and legalizes incarcerated people to be treated as slaves. Now, a while back, Kanye West got into a lot of hot water for his take on the 13th Amendment. And I'm not really going to defend him here, but I will say his argument wasn't very compelling. Derrick's here is, but Derrick is a lawyer, so I wanted to draw that distinction. Many incarcerated people became mentally ill from long years in punitive housing, myself included. I spent 10 years in segregation housing where I was confined for 23 hours a day. If we are to make a fairer society, where all people are treated fairly and with dignity, we must start with eradicating any laws and institutions that discriminate against individuals. Institutions like prisons destroy families, don't make communities safer, and intensify poverty. As long as any member of society can be treated as a slave, there will be abuse of power by the slave owner. History has taught us no less. And this, gets back to where, as an alternative to prisons, in the event that someone is deemed so much a threat that they must be separated from society, having them live in some sort of residential community is a much more humane way of handling things. And it can potentially rehabilitate them over time if they were able to live with their dignity as a human being rather than as a slave. But most shouldn't even need to be incarcerated in the first place. Together, President Clinton's 1994 and 1996 reforms led to my spending 21 years in prison. In the absence of such laws, the officer that framed me for murder would not have had the powerful resources and the ability to do so. He still receives a pension from New York City and has not been held accountable for any of his actions, despite the fact that dozens of his past murder cases are under investigation. Reform may sound appealing, but we must abolish laws and institutions that have been enacted to give police and prisons more power and immunity. A society that holds everyone accountable is the only one worth living in. It is the first step toward honoring the dignity and fundamental humanity of Black and brown people. He's making an appeal here which is specifically against the way that the legal system protects police and the courts. And not just them, but also lawmakers. In the past 4 years, if they've taught us anything, it's that people who are in these positions of power, they're not bound by the law at all. Whether it be, Devin Nunes or Bill Barr or any of those folks, And there's a number of Democrats as well who just regularly run afoul of, ethics violations and campaign finance, all these sorts of things. Like, they know that there's not a downside for doing it. So they do it. Our legal system is designed to keep the most disadvantaged at a disadvantage, to keep the most impoverished in destitute conditions, and basically maintain a carceral slave population. If you analyze the effects of it, that is the only conclusion you can come to. Especially when you add in things like denying people even the right to appeal their own situations and such. I do strongly recommend digging into the New Yorker article. It goes through his history, his conviction, his time in jail. It's a very good read. It's a fairly lengthy read, which is... I mean, I don't mind doing lengthy reads on stream, and maybe I will do this one this week or something. But I want to cover some other stuff tonight, so I do strongly recommend it. I'll drop it in the Discord as well, in case you didn't get it, or in case you didn't catch it here live. But yeah, it's really disturbing how much he went through. 21 years, and it wasn't like you said, he was also in isolation for a lot of those, and he was regularly mistreated, abused. He was denied his things frequently, and all for a crime he didn't commit. He had people who could testify to his alibi, and that was thrown out in court in favor of what turned out to be falsified testimony, coerced by an investigating detective. All just to try to make more arrests, because the metrics say more arrests good, actually, in police departments. So, yeah. The only silver lining here is he did eventually get his freedom returned, but there's no giving him back 21 years of his life lost. So, yeah. That was Derrick Hamilton, No Justice, No Freedom. 17th essay of 30 in the Abolition for the People series. We're cruising through these. One a week.